I'd like to introduce to you our two panelists, Chris Berg and Sinclair Davidson. Chris Berg is a postdoc fellow at RMIT University and a senior fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. He's also the author of 5 books, including In Defense of Freedom of Speech, In Defense of Freedom of Speech from Ancient Greece to Andrew Bolt. He's also one of Australia's most prominent voices for free markets and individual liberty, and a leading authority in overregulation, economic freedom, and civil liberties. He's been published in Australian Financial Review and the Sydney Morning Herald, as well as others, including The Quadrant and The Spectator Australia. Sinclair Davidson is a professor of institutional economics at the School of Economics, Finance and Marketing at RMIT University. He's also a senior research fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs and an academic fellow for the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. He's contributed public debate and been published in The Age, Australian Financial Review, Daily Telegraph, etc. He also blogs at the Cadillac Files. And yeah, so first up, I would like to introduce Chris Berg, and he'll let you know what he's going to speak about.
Can I close this? Can I close this screen? That's all good? All right. No, I can't close it. Did I kill it? Yeah. Oh, well. Wow. All right. Thank you so much for that introduction. When I spoke to Tim Andrews about this session, he asked me to speak about Libertarianism 101 rather than Econ 101. Don't fear, there will be an Econ 101 talk from Sinclair in just a moment, but I'm going to start by talking about libertarianism, an introduction to libertarianism. It will make more sense and it will be more useful than you think. Because the way I understand libertarianism and the way I'm going to argue for libertarianism it will actually be the foundations of much of what Sinclair's argument is, you know, what you really need to know about economics as well. So as it was mentioned, my name is Chris Berg. I'm with RMIT, the IPA. I'm also with the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. I'm going to give a Libertarianism 101 talk. Last year, I published a book basically on this, The Libertarian Alternative, which was the first book about libertarianism in Australia in 40 years. It's available at all bookstores and on Kindle. Don't be embarrassed to buy the book on your phone now. I'll wait. Oh, sorry. www.amazon.com/libertarian alternative Chris Berg, ebook/DP/B01DYDF08W. Good. So, okay. Because you obviously haven't had time to read the book yet, what is libertarianism? Let me give the quick answer first. Libertarianism is the political philosophy of liberty, of freedom, understood as the minimization of government coercion and the maximization of individual choice. From these basic precepts, libertarian thinkers and policy specialists have applied those principles to public policy across the board. Libertarianism tells us that we should be able to trade with each other voluntarily and according to our own understanding of our best interests, because voluntary trade makes people, each person, party to that trade, better off. Trade across national borders should be free, and people should be able to sell their labour at a price of their own choosing. In other words, there ought to be no constraints on, like, the minimum wage. There should be few government controls on trade, economic activity, and social activity. That is, there should be limited red tape and regulation. Government should be small and tax little. Civil society should be allowed to flourish, and charity and social protection along with it. Our preferences are our business, so no to the nanny state. People should be free to seek and pursue the lives they want. This leads us to one controversial position these days. My argument is that libertarians should support significantly expanded immigration and see the backlash against immigration as profoundly anti-libertarian, but let's leave that kettle of fish for questions. Anyway, libertarianism looks like a very radical program. It's neither really left or right, and the word appears in the political sense really only in the late 19th century, and many explicitly libertarian institutions, like the Libertarian Party in the United States, are barely half a century old. We had a short-lived Libertarian Party in the 1970s, the Workers' Party, of course, and the Liberal Democrats, who was who's of course enjoying Senate representation with David Leonhelm, at the moment was founded just less than 2 decades ago. But libertarianism is heir to a much older tradition, the liberalism of John Locke and Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. Our libertarianism today would be nothing without the radical anti-authoritarianism of Locke, the anti-establishment market economics of Smith, and Mill's deep understanding of the relationship between liberty and human flourishing. And so in that context, what I want to do today is draw attention to Australia's lost and forgotten libertarian heritage. That liberalism of Locke and Smith and Mill was a dominant and substantial intellectual tradition in Australia during the 19th century. 19th century colonists stocked their libraries with these great English liberal authors. They argued over free trade and individual rights. They published books on liberalism and liberal economics that were globally recognised at the time as classics and still appear on sites of liberalism and libertarian content today. It is those liberals, indeed, who fought hardest against the White Australia policy when it was introduced at the urging of the Labor movement. The fact that this tradition went into hiding during the 20th century, the fact that you need less than one hand to count the number of conservative and liberal historians of Australia that have explored this, should not blind us to our great intellectual heritage. So why would one support libertarian ideas? There are a lot of approaches you can take to the philosophy of liberty. Many libertarians are attracted to the idea of a non-aggression principle, which says that aggression or the initiation of force of violence is inherently illegitimate, whether that aggression comes from an individual or individuals acting as a government. I'd like to propose another reason, however, to be attracted to libertarianism, which I lay out in the book. Libertarianism is designed to deal with the two great challenges of social organisation, that of knowledge and that of power. Utopian socialists and utopian conservatives have long imagined societies ordered by benevolent governments. But any historical attempt to bring those societies into being has floundered on the fact that governments just are not all-seeing and all-knowing. When Joseph Stalin was trying to centrally plan the economy of the Russian Empire, his Politburo, that is basically the cabinet of the Soviet Union, had to deal with upwards of 1,000 agenda items per meeting as they tried to push resources back and forth throughout the Soviet economy. In societies more caring about individual rights than Stalin's Russia, of course, the knowledge problem is even worse. Stalin didn't have to worry about what people wanted. Modern governments have to at least pretend to try, but how on earth can governments know what people want, at what price, under what circumstances? How can governments know what lives to lead? This is a very roundabout way of talking about Hayek's knowledge problem, the first problem of social organisation. The second problem is power. We don't trust governments. We can't trust governments. This is not because government is full of villains, although obviously that's true, but because it is full of people, mostly normal people who want what mostly normal people want. They want money, they want luxury, they want a cushy job, they want prestige, they want authority, sometimes they want control. And university professors, yeah. Governments, university professors. People are lazy and greedy, again, university professors. Giving people government roles with coercive power over others brings out their worst. This is the problem of incentives. Even if a government could know and see everything, we could never trust it to do so in our interests. My argument is that these twin challenges suggest to us that government should be small. It should be strictly and constitutionally limited. It should keep out of things it has no business being in. It should maximise individual rights and minimise its control over our lives. That is why libertarianism. Because government isn't magic, it's just a bunch of flawed, ignorant people with guns. Finally, I'd like to draw out, and perhaps this is useful for discussion later, I'd like to draw out one distinction that is particularly relevant in today's libertarian discussions. This is the idea of thick libertarianism versus thin libertarianism. Thin libertarianism says that libertarianism is concerned with one thing and one thing only, the proper use of the coercive power of the state. Thick libertarianism says that libertarianism is a more all-encompassing ethical doctrine about individual worth, the nature of non-coercive relationships, and even about culture. As I've said, libertarianism is a political philosophy. It's political in the sense that it's concerned with the organisation of a society of individuals and groups. That's the thin libertarian model. But if it is to be meaningful as a philosophy, in my view, it is important for libertarians to reckon with the implications of their belief in individual worth and value. What that means for our understanding of democracy and democratic institutions, of notions of community and foreignness, of the exclusion of groups of people from social traditions. One reason I think that the thick libertarian vision is most compelling is because it recognises the tradition from which our libertarianism grew out. An anti-authoritarian tradition, anti-imperial, pro-toleration, pro-tolerance, anti-censorship, but most of all, a tradition that held a deep concern for human flourishing and individual self-worth. Now, having very unsatisfactorily opened that giant can of worms, I'd like to ask Sinclair Davidson to the podium.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for inviting me. It's always a bit daunting to speak after Christopher because he actually prepares very well, and I kind of make slides and hoof it. But Christopher has destroyed my slides, so we're just going to have to hoof it. Now, as it actually turned out, when Tim asked me to speak at the conference, he said, "Sinclair, let's play some games." And I said, "Okay, yeah, I know spin the bottle and strip poker from my student days. I recall these games well." And he said, no, we want to teach people games about exchange. And I said, "Oh, yeah." I said, "Well, I don't normally do this sort of thing." He said, "No, don't worry. There's a package that you download off the internet. And you download the package and we'll play the games in the venue." I said, "Okay, I'll do that." And I downloaded the package off the internet. And it came along, and I saw that you had to have these tokens. And the tokens had to be cut out and coloured in. And I thought, okay, this is great fun, having to cut out and colour in these tokens. And this reminded me when I was a student, I used to date a young lady who was studying pre-primary education. And I used to spend many evenings cutting out and colouring in for her, thanks, Will, cutting out and colouring in for her student portfolios and what have you. And it just occurred to me that Tim just doesn't do it for me, thank you, in the same way that Leslie did, so we're not playing games. All right, so unfortunately there has been a bit of false advertising, so we won't be playing games. But certainly I'm going to pick up at the end of Chris's talk about the knowledge problem, because that certainly permeates all of economics. But before we even get to that, just the very basic question, what is economics about? Now, normally in Economics 101, we would start off with a definition of economics, and we would talk about Paul Samuelson and what is to be made and for whom and all this sort of nonsense. Or we would say economics is what economists do, or we'd say economics is about everyday life, and so on and so forth. Ultimately and fundamentally, economics is about exchange and trade. Not international trade, not fair trade, just any trade. It is about exchange. Economists should be talking about trading. Interacting with different people, that's what economics is about. If you start thinking that economics is about efficiency, you are going to get into a lot of trouble very quickly, and basically you're going to be a social engineer. Because we can all have ideas of what is efficient. Pareto, optimality, all that sort of stuff, these are value judgments. My idea of efficiency is you all give me your money. Okay, that would be a very, very efficient society. And I'm sure you would have your own visions of the efficient society. So I always try to steer people away from ideas of efficiency. Sometimes I do use words like optimal. I might say something like the optimal inflation rate is 0. The optimal tax rate is 0. Optimal levels of crime are not 0, for example. So things like that. But it's all about exchange and trade. And from there we build up a story? How do we facilitate trade? Why do we need to trade? And then you start talking about the division of labor. You then start talking about institutions, the norms that govern our trading and so on. So that is what economics is really about. For economics is really fun stuff. You know, why drug dealers live with their mothers, why sumo wrestlers cheat. It's all very good fun stuff, and if you're on a long flight, you should perhaps think about that sort of stuff. But it's not serious. When we interview academics at RMIT for positions, we always have one stock question. The one stock question is, tell us one article or book that has inspired you as an economist. And we once had some weirdo talking about the Samuelson-Stopler theorem. But normally people talk about something or the other. Those who say they've been inspired to become economists by reading Freakonomics don't ever get employed. It's just one of these strange things. It just doesn't sound quite right. So economics is about exchange and trade. Now, why should we care? Now, here I'm going to contradict myself very slightly. I've taken the freedom to trade data from the Index of Economic Freedom, and what they do is they say this is about international trade, not domestic trade. And I've said, of course, economics is about all trade. Somehow we seem to think that trading with a foreigner is somehow different from trading with a domestic person. That is just simply not true. Although there is much to dislike about foreigners. I've loathed foreigners since I became a citizen. But there are. The benefits of trade are massive. So if you just have a look, those economies that have got more trade have higher per capita income. Now, you may say to me, GDP is a terrible number and doesn't measure all sorts of things, and yes, this is true. GDP tends to be very highly correlated with any other number that you really think is important. There is less hunger. Remember, in free market economies, you simply do not ever have mass starvation. And better environmental performance, if you think those things are important. Economies that trade have better indicators across the board, and that's all very good. Okay, so if economics is about trade, what are the problems we face in the economy? And it's not foreigners, it's not culture, it's not taxes. It is taxes, but that's another hat. I'll be talking about that perhaps tomorrow. But the biggest problem facing the economy is twofold: information costs and transaction costs. I went to a talk by Mike Mungo a few months ago where he said it is all transactions costs. And yeah, I suppose to the extent that you think information costs are a subsection of transaction costs, but these are the problems. Information costs and transaction costs explain so much of the world that we don't understand necessarily, especially if you've come through economics in the neoclassical type framework. Once you start thinking about information costs and transaction costs, you understand a lot more. So our friends in Treasury in Canberra, some of them might be here. Sorry to slag you off. Not that sorry. But our friends in Canberra tend to think a lot about whenever there's something they don't quite understand, they think about monopoly. This is a monopoly. It must be stopped. So Jason and I were involved last year or the year before, I can't remember, on the interchange fees. And interchange fees were being sold by the government as a secret bank fee that you pay. And of course, everybody knows secret is bad and bank fee is bad too. So this was obviously a terrible thing, and they went in and just regulated it. And Jason and I actually explained that this was about information costs and transaction costs. It makes perfect sense once you actually understand the incentive structures that go into the interchange fees. And so these things actually explain a lot about the world that we might otherwise think is big business ripping us off. It also explains why we shouldn't trust government. In almost every course I ever teach, I include something called the Socialist calculation debate, and I always have an assignment in every course that I teach on the Socialist calculation debate. And in honor of, I brought my Hayek t-shirt. I did wear my Friedman t-shirt last year. The problem with Friedman, of course, is this is the man who invented withholding income tax. and is clearly a communist and can never be forgiven. There are some things, of course, people can do wrong and apologize for, but with inventing the withholding income tax, of course, is totally wrong. Chris, in a very excellent op-ed in the Drum in 2011, I think it was, had this great line saying the big economics debate of the 20th century was not between Keynes and Hayek, and we can say that because Steve's gone home, was not between Keynes and Hayek, but in actual fact is between Hayek and Langer, and Mises as well. And in the assignments, I always try and change the meaning or change the word away from socialist calculation debate. I now prefer to call it the economic calculation debate, because a lot of students see the word socialist and then they run off on all sorts of tangents. But more or less, the idea that you can plan an economy at a macro level scale. This is an experiment that has been tried. This is an experiment that we have given our absolute damnedest to make work. Half the world, at least at some point, has tried this particular experiment. And of course, there's always excuses. It wasn't done properly. We didn't try this. They were peasants. They weren't sophisticated, what have you. But you can take a very simple experiment. You can take an economy divided into 2 bits. You can say, look, we will let the commies have the industrial part of the economy and we will give the capitalists the farmland. Okay? And you fast forward this 50 years or so, and it's been done twice. East and West Germany, North and South Korea. And you observe what happens. The industrial space of the economy, which gets given to the socialists, ends up collapsing. The farmland, the capitalists actually turn into valuable property. But in the economic calculation debate, there's 2 stories that are going on here. One, the first story is you can replicate what the market can do, and secondly, you can improve what the market does. And every single time this has been attempted, it has failed. It has failed dismally, and the millions of dead people attest to this failure. Of course, the issue really isn't about socialism at a macro level. The issue is as follows. In the absence of market prices, resources must be allocated using a political process. And that political process is not going to satisfy consumers and users. Large segments of the Australian economy, oh well, never mind, we won't call Will back again. Large segments of the Australian economy are actually under political control at some level or another. The health system, the education system, the immigration system. We have a government that thinks that they can put quotas on importing goat herds. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. We expect them to do badly in these things, and they do. So where you have resources allocated in a non-market process, you have problems. So those are the 2 biggest problems in the economy. What can go wrong? Well, 2 things can go wrong. There are lots of biases in our society. The first one is an anti-market bias. As Mike Munger was saying, you can't really just stand up and say, well, the market will solve that. We don't know what's going to happen, but we know it will happen. That's not particularly reassuring. There's an anti-foreign bias. As you discovered, we loathe foreigners. They've got different cultures. They speak with funny accents. They play rugby. All these things that we certainly shouldn't allow that type here. There's a make-work bias. You know, make-work is actually very popular. When you have the work for the dole scheme, why would you have bureaucrats sitting around thinking of things for people who are unemployed to do when they don't know what they do themselves? I would rather have the private sector making work for unemployed people. Pessimism bias. We're all going to go to hell. The property market is about to collapse. As it happens, my wife got bored recently and sold our house, so I'm short the housing market at the moment. So I'd be very happy if housing prices were to collapse, but I suspect not. Then there's utopia, the social engineers. The grass will be greener on the other side. If we only have this small little tax, it'll all work out well. People could be different. That somehow that if they just explain to us that we should care about global warming or rising sea levels or acidification or whatever it is, that we would say, I'm prepared to pay a higher tax and not have electricity. Or there's a free lunch. We can make the world very, we can make these changes without impacting anybody, anywhere or any time. So, it's all about trade. What can go wrong? What's important? Most important, the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men and women how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. And that's it, and I think we're going to go to questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sinclair and Chris. We've got a bit of time, so I'll go through some of the questions. Got a question, I guess this would be for Sinclair, from Vickers, about the balance of trade between nations, and does that matter?
No. Sorry, are we on?
At the bottom.
Oh, excellent. No, it doesn't. The trade balance is one of those figures that if it actually wasn't ever collected, nobody would know what it was. Whereas if inflation is high, we all know prices are going up. If people are unemployed, we all understand that the trade balance is a number that they could easily stop collecting and nobody would ever notice. So I wouldn't worry at all about the trade balance. As a matter of fact, I did some research on the trade balance in the late 1990s where the government was bringing out monthly numbers, which they would then correct for a trailing period of almost 2 years. And it turned out that the monthly numbers they were bringing out were almost random forecasts. And then they would try and correct over time. And it was just this absolute schmozzle. They've actually stopped doing that subsequently. But yeah, the trade balance figures are completely nonsensical numbers.
Question for Chris. How would you differentiate libertarianism from things like neoliberalism and classical liberalism?
That's a really interesting question. So I think neoliberalism, I have an argument that neoliberalism is a meaningful term, that it does describe something that happened, a collection of ideas that happened in developed countries like Australia, the UK, the United States, over the last couple of decades. When people talk about neoliberalism, of course, they're usually using that as a cipher for, you just mean really right-wing economics. But if you look at the changes that happened after, say, the 1980s in Australia, it wasn't that we massively deregulated the economy, lowered barriers to trade, privatised all these systems. What we privatised all these nationalised companies. What we did is we did privatise a lot of companies. We did change some regulation, but in fact, that period sparked the growth of what we now call the regulatory state. We changed our mind about what the government, we as a society changed our mind about what government should do. They shouldn't own the telecommunications network, until recently anyway. They shouldn't own Telstra, I should say, but they would regulate it instead. And we look at the data about the growth of regulation and red tape in the Australian economy, and it starts just when the left are telling us that we started deregulating. So I've got this wonderful graph, which is just the pages of legislation passed by the Australian Parliament from Federation. And it's not flat, but it's close to flat until the late 1970s. And then it goes like that. And we passed between 6,000 and 10,000 pages of legislation in the Australian Parliament every single year. That's the regulatory state. So when people talk about neoliberalism, I think that is a meaningful concept. Yeah, neoliberals have talked a lot of good stuff about shrinking the government and returning government to the people and so forth. But in practice, every government that has described itself in that way, from both left and right, has ended up regulating our economy substantially more. That's what I think neoliberalism is. And that is obviously substantially different from the vision of libertarianism that I think anybody in this room holds and certainly have outlined. Classical liberalism. So I actually view the debate between libertarians and classical liberals on the terminological debate as a bit unnecessary, excessive. I've got Tim Wilson spoke last night. Tim wants us to all call ourselves liberal. I have no problems with that. Libertarianism is a reasonably new word. It's a niche word. If we stopped using the word libertarian, we would discover that there are more libertarians out there, I suspect. But it is actually a. I don't think we should completely abandon it. I don't think that it is without use, because it is a coherent political philosophy. I hear a lot of people describe themselves as classical liberals. Could mean anything. Could be very wishy-washy. I'm sure those in this room who are describing themselves as classical liberals don't fall into that category. But it is very often just used as a placeholder. Oh yeah, I guess I'm sort of for lower taxes and that sort of thing. Libertarianism, to have the word libertarianism, I think describes a coherent political philosophy, but it describes a very broad, coherent political philosophy where you have sort of liberals on one end and anarcho-capitalists on the other. I think it's worth using, it's worth saving, it's worth defending, but the never-ending terminological discussion I find.
From Mason to Philly, for Sinclair, what are your thoughts on the existing GST distribution system? And do you think it can be improved in areas of efficiency and equity?
In the ideal world, we would abolish the GST and replace it with a state-based income tax, because I think that people who spend the money should raise the money themselves, and it shouldn't be collected and given to them from Canberra. In terms of the GST distribution, I understand that the Western Australians are really angry about it. And perhaps they have got good reason to be particularly angry about it. The difficulty that I have, though, is that what is happening in Western Australia isn't anything strange or unusual. It's not an anomaly. It's actually how the system was designed to operate. The Commonwealth Grants Commission had an horrendous formula, which is basically penalises states for improving economic efficiency in their states, for bringing in good policy. It takes money off them for doing that and then gives it to South Australia and Tasmania. And of course they have become more or less mendicant states, which of course Tasmanians, I'm really sorry, but that's basically what it is. And so the issue is, what is the underlying philosophy of equalisation grant funding like the GST actually operates? And the GST is actually designed to operate as a top-up. It is not designed to basically provide you with funding. It is a top-up to ensure that all citizens of the Commonwealth can have access to equal levels of care based across the two levels of government. Now, it turns out that Western Australia has got lots of other economic opportunities, and it doesn't need to be topped up in the manner in which the Australian government tops up states. It has its own money. Now, it is very unfortunate that the Western Australian government has chosen to spend their money that they have from their royalties in building white elephants and infrastructure projects that are not valuable and so on and so forth, but that is not our problem, that is their choice. And so I would leave the GST distribution more or less unchanged, because that is the deal that we all went to the 98 election with. Everybody always says that the government made a deal with Meg and the Democrats. The Australian government made a deal with the Australian people at the 98 election as to how the system was going to work. And if we're going to change the system, we should go to another election. And of course, we would go to an election where I would hope significant parts of the population would say, why do we have a GST at all? So I would leave well enough alone. I would say to our Western Australian friends, before you come out east with your begging bowls, please spend your money more wisely.
Got a question from David Lionhelm about how do we decide whether the government should do something instead of private individuals. I guess this could be either.
So we're looking for a formula, or the costs of government intervention in most areas of public policy are much higher than the standard tools by which you would make that judgment suggest. So normally, if you're having a discussion about public policy, whether it's a spending or regulation measure, you will run it through a cost-benefit analysis. The government will propose something, the bureaucracy will write up a regulatory impact statement. They will have some estimate of the compliance burden and so on and so forth. That's all, you know, I'm not against that. I guess that helps in a small way. But they don't take into account the fact that the existence of that government program is going to create demand for that program to be extended to other areas. The existence of that program is going to, it could easily be captured by individuals within the government or within the within society or in industry to try to, you know, claim benefits themselves. It's going to enhance the power of government and work against our interest in the liberty sense. So they don't take all this sort of stuff into account. They don't take into account the dynamics of political power when it gets expanded. I think that we need to do that. I think that we need to start making the point that the government comes up with a lot of interesting ideas. Sometimes the government can come up with things that might be very hard for us to argue against. Who can criticize the moral foundation of something like disability spending? But the downstream consequences of something like the NDIS, which has been introduced in an incredibly messy fashion, incredibly complicated, incredibly expensive way, will be quite significant and quite problematic from both a liberty and a fiscal perspective. So this doesn't answer David's question. Unfortunately, this doesn't help Australia's Libertarian Senator, but it does give us a guide about how to view policy change and policy recommendations as they come through individually. We've got to view the political system as a more dynamic system rather than this static idea of, well, we'll just add one more policy. Oh, it's just one more policy, that's fine. It's very justifiable by its own. Yeah, that'd be the approach I'd take. So I'd be interested in Sinclair to do that.
More or less, I'd agree with what Christopher has said. But I would also start off with, if you listen to how, say, the shadow assistant treasurer talks about these sort of things, he always says, I'm not interested in the total quantum of spending, I'm interested in the quality of spending. And of course, you can always tell a story about the quality of spending. It's like the good debt, bad debt sort of debate. Nobody's ever going to stand up and say, we're going to increase bad debt this year. Or the government's never going to say, we are going to spend money badly. Which, of course, there are always very, very good reasons for governments to spend money. I would start off on a philosophical basis and say, well, what is it that the government should be doing? And what is the maximum size of what the government should be? I would also look at our institutions. We have a Commonwealth Constitution. Anything that should be done by the states, I would give back to the states and say, you do it and you finance it. And anything that the Commonwealth should do should be done by the Commonwealth. And I would start off by saying that, you know, unless you are an anarchist, there has to be some level of government. But how big or small that government is of course the issue. And I would start off by saying genuinely public goods should be funded by the government out of taxation revenue, and that's normally foreign defence. And apart from that, I'm kind of scratching. I would have some levels of health spending. I think arguments are, I'm going to upset some people here. I think some arguments for vaccinations are good. You should vaccinate your children, you should vaccinate yourselves too. I think you should pay for it yourself. I think that should be means tested. So genuine safety nets, genuine means testing, national security. I once told a Liberal Party function that there should be means tested of school fees. They were very rude to me, I have to say. But so genuine safety net features, genuine public health features, which more beyond vaccinations and dread disease and epidemics, there's very little of that. And national defence, and after that I would be thinking, because the costs of government intervention are much higher than we normally think, very often because of information costs and transaction costs, that we should be demanding much stronger arguments to support any interventions.
Cool, thanks. Got a question from Joseph Clark, interesting one actually, about behavioural economics and whether it's a friend or enemy of free market economics. Sinclair.
Behavioural economics is a response to the standard neoclassical approach to economics, where the standard neoclassical approach to economics makes some very, very strong assumptions about human behaviour. And of course, we are unsurprised when actual humans deviate from those very strong assumptions. And most of behavioral economics is actually a critique of neoclassical economics and those assumptions. If you think neoclassical economics is a crock to begin with, by extension, I think behavioral economics is a crock too. I think those areas where it tells us interesting things tend to be very trivial. And Chris and I have a paper, I hope, Jason, is our paper coming out in the Journal of Behavioral Economics and Policy.
He nodded his head.
Yes, good. So
That's a contract.
We have a contract. So Jason and I have a paper, Chris and I have a paper coming out at the Journal of Behavioral Economics and Policy, which Jason is editing. No pressure, Jason. Where I actually wanted to call the paper Behavioral Economics as a mild form of fascism. And Jason, very unreasonably the fascist, has said, no, I can't call this paper a mild form of fascism. But it is a mild, in my opinion, a mild form of fascism. As I said, the examples where it's interesting are trivial. You don't need economics to tell you that. You don't need experimentation to tell you that. And apart from that, it just tells us that neoclassical economics makes strong assumptions about human behavior, which we knew already. So it's not clear to me what the issue is, but the two quotes, I've got the one quote in the paper from Hayek, where I say the curious task of economics, and the other quote from Karl Marx, where I say where Karl Marx said that the objective is not to understand the world, but to change the world. And that's what our behavioral economist friends are more or less up to.
I'd like to add to that, which will be slightly contradictory to what Sinclair said, but there's two levels in which behavioural economics is relevant. There's it as an intellectual endeavour in universities and by academics, but also its policy relevance, which is that some of those sometimes, well, in fact, usually trivial insights get translated into public policy really quickly. The book Nudge was published in 2008, something like that. In 2010, the Cameron government set up a nudge unit. This has incredible political power. I think that we can, as libertarians, use the success, the policy success or the policy influence of behavioural economics against the state. The story goes like this. We analyse with the tools of behavioural economics the actions of individuals in marketplaces. You know, are they risk averse? Do they lack knowledge? All very, very interesting things. We can do the same to the government. Governments are full of people. Those people are subject to all the mental errors that they've been attributed to by the behavioural economists. There's no reason the government would be better at it, and lots of reasons to suggest that they would be worse at making decisions than people in marketplaces. What does it mean if a government bureaucrat is risk-averse, quick to judgment, affected too heavily by stereotypes that don't meet the data? I think we can actually apply those small insights of behavioural economics to government choices, and I think it would be very devastating for government. I think it would suggest to us that at the very least we should allow, if we're going to allow any flawed people to make decisions, at least those decisions should be made by the people they affect, not by bureaucrats.
Thanks. I've got a few questions about foreign investment, so I guess I'll wrap them into one. So can you comment on foreign investment relating mostly to housing markets and also Chinese investments from state-owned companies?
Well, as I said, at the moment I am short the housing market, so of course foreigners should be definitely kept down. But when I was selling my house, I was very annoyed that I was unable to sell my house to any of those wonderful Chinese people because I've got a second-hand house and not a first-hand house. I think the artificial constraint of not allowing foreigners to buy property in Australia is a bit silly. And it does strike me that it creates all these artificial incentives and disincentives and so on and so forth. I mean, whenever I see in the newspaper that the Treasurer has ordered some Chinese millionaire to sell his $20 million house in Port Piper because there are first homeowners who can't afford to buy houses, I always think, well, are they going to buy a $20 million house in Port Piper? Really? So it is silly, it is populist policy, it is anti-foreign bias. There is an excellent paper in the CIS Policy magazine of 2009, 2010, somewhere around about there, written by myself, on Chinese government-owned enterprises buying Australian companies. And this does cause a lot of excitement because the argument always goes along the lines of something like, we try to get our own government to privatise as many companies as possible. Why should we allow foreign governments to own companies in Australia? Isn't that a contradictory thing? And the argument that I made is no, it's not contradictory because the Chinese government has no government power in Australia. It has power in China, but it has no government authority in Australia. It is simply another large foreigner. And if we are worried about big companies behaving badly in Australia, we should make sure that our company laws are appropriate, that they apply to everybody, and that they inhibit whatever bad behavior we can imagine it could possibly be. But it's not clear to me that we should be worried about foreign governments. We should be worrying most about our own government, and we should make sure that our laws and policies and institutional features of our society are the way we want them to be. And if you get that formula right, and we might not get that formula right, but if we get that formula right, I don't think we have to worry about foreign investment. Certainly, I think the Foreign Investment Review Board should be abolished. It is an inherently racist organisation, and we should treat it with the same contempt as we would other racists.
What about black money in China?
I'll just add one very quick thing.
Their money's pink. What are you talking about?
Dodgy money.
What is dodgy money?
So
there's no dodgy money. There's dodgy people.
to be opposed to foreign investment in Australia, in my mind, is to be opposed to all investment in Australia. Because what's the argument? So a Chinese firm's going to come in and act not in Australia's national interest, or they're going to come in and act in China's national interest. Well, every investor in Australia might not act in Australia's national interest. In fact, they're very unlikely to act in Australia's interest. They're going to act in their own interest. That's what private property is. To be angry that someone is going to buy something and not use it for the nation of Australia is to be angry that private investors own anything at all, including houses, land, all that sort of stuff. It's a nonsensical argument, it's a nonsensical argument. It's applied primarily to countries that we don't like for xenophobic reasons, rather than anything else.
Thanks. Got a question from Justin Workman to Chris about government departments. Which ones would you privatise immediately?
5. They don't make any money. You can't privatise them.
Or get rid of, yeah.
Which ones? Oh, well, they're really obvious low-hanging fruit. I'm not saying low-hanging political fruit, but things that wouldn't change Australia's living standards one iota. You could get rid of the ABC just tomorrow.
Doctor Who.
Sorry?
There's Doctor Who on the ABC.
There's Doctor Who on the ABC.
That would be a huge
It's
one.
available on some sites on the internet. I don't want to talk about that in public, obviously. Sinclair's argument is you go through the Constitution and you say, well, does the Constitution say we should have a health department or any interest in health or education? Well, if it doesn't, then it shouldn't. Bear in mind the Australian Constitution allows the Commonwealth to do a massive amount of stuff. If they can't squeeze it into there, then they're not really trying. I would, anything that, the NBN we should shut down, or certainly privatise. Often when you privatise these things, you're only privatising their assets. They're not going to operate by themselves. This is a problem with the ABC, of course. It wouldn't be profitable, so it would just be, you'd be selling it off for scrap. Look, and then Sinclair, there's a argument that Mises has a list of things that the government should do, doesn't it? Which I'm going to ask you to recite off the top.
There is an apocryphal story that Mises said that if the government was going to do anything, it should at least subsidise the opera, because he enjoyed going to the opera. But the story is also contradicted. So a lot of people say it never happened or it did happen or what have you. But it is a lovely story because, well, maybe not the opera, but a television station just showing Doctor Who could be something okay. I could live with it, I could force myself. But when I get asked this question, I normally say I would start off by any government department with the word commission in its name would go. Any government department with the word Australian in its name would be on the chopping block. I would definitely get rid of the federal departments of education and health because I can't see what they do. Very often these organizations use borrowed money to pay bureaucrats to distribute borrowed money to other people again. So I'll be shutting down a great deal of it. I think we could probably reasonably end up with a, we'd obviously have to have a tax department, about 10 people I reckon could do it. We'd have to have a tax department, we'd have to have a treasury, we'd probably have to have a justice department, and after that, kind of scratching at the federal government level, what we really need.
Defence.
Defence, yes, I did mention defence before. Nukes in orbit, and that's the kind of defence. You've got to have a robust defence. But again, it's, you know, I hate to be horrible, but we subcontract our defence out to the United States, and we've got to ask the question, is it appropriate or not? If it's not appropriate, we probably have to spend a lot more on defence than we currently do, but we've got all those savings from the health department. So, you know, that is an open question as to how much we spend on defence. My preference would be a bit more, perhaps, but, you know, we're getting it on the cheap at the moment. We can't complain.
Cool. Take another question from Eva Christensen. And this one is about, you know, hyperinflation with public debt and quantitative easing and all these things. How do you see this monetary experiment going?
I've actually been quite concerned about inflation for a while. It certainly has not manifested itself in consumer price index as I had expected it would, but it does seem to have manifested itself in housing prices and other asset prices. I'm also concerned about the fact that when interest rates start rising and American banks are sitting on all this cash on their balance sheets, they might start pumping this cash out into the economy. So certainly I think consumer price inflation has been kept under control for a long, long time, much longer than I ever anticipated. But certainly I think we shouldn't be feeling too relaxed about how we're going to go moving forward. Certainly economic growth hasn't materialized as we hoped. People's living standards seem to have declined. So we're in a situation where real wages have probably declined over the last few years, and yet housing prices have gone through the roof. It does seem to be somewhat anomalous, and I think if we're not careful, we might actually see a lot of inflation. And a lot of people make the argument that quantitative easing has managed to get us out of the global financial crisis. But of course, we haven't unwound that quantitative easing. You know, so if they can have gone into quantitative easing and unwind it without destroying the economy, I think that'll be quite a feat. We'll have to think a bit more carefully about how we think about the world. But until they've actually unwound it, we can't be sure what the effect is going to be. But I wouldn't be surprised if we saw lots more inflation in the future.
Cool. I'll just take two more questions and then that'll be all we have time for. So for Chris, on the topic of government power, if people have a particular goal and the government intervention is the quickest and most efficient way to achieve that goal, how can we convince people to go through voluntary means which may be slower in achieving those goals? How do we sell that?
The assumption is that it would be quicker and more efficient, and when we say more efficient, I mean in the broader sense, is it going, not just is it cheapest, but is it going to harm liberty? Is it going to damage notions of community? Is it overriding people's preferences? Is it changing the way people want to live their lives? You hear this question a lot from doctors, actually. Or you get this sort of story from doctors, and doctors come across a lot of people who make bad decisions about themselves. If they've got obesity-related health issues, the doctor thinks to themselves, well, I know how to fix this. You just you eat, exercise and eat a different diet and so forth, and then your health problem will go away. Or you should just stop smoking. Your emphysema is because you're smoking. They say, I'm sure, but and then they come back 6 weeks later and they're still smoking. Like, yeah, I understand. And so the doctor now thinks to themselves, after having done that with over many years, well, there's this big giant thing in Canberra that can just write laws that say he can't smoke anymore. It'll fix it. So that there'll be none of this challenge with his own personal motivation, but would just be able to fix it. Now, we know that it's nowhere near as simple as that, for lots of different reasons, because it changes the balance of power in society. It's rarely effective. When it is effective, it's harmful for other things that we find important, like freedom of choice and so forth, like that person's deliberate decision to trade off their health for pleasure or laziness or whatever it is that they value. We have to demonstrate that the assumption that the government should act if there is a problem has embedded within it many other assumptions about the role and relationship of the individual and society.
Cool. And so this is the final question for the session. This particular questioner, Sinclair, asks, your economic understanding is so good. Where can I come in and understand and study such good economics? If I have to choose a university in Australia, which ones would it be to study economics and not be a commie? And by the way, the questioner is Jason Potts.
Well, it depends if you're a postgraduate or an undergraduate. If you're a postgraduate, there's only one university to study at, and that's with Jason and myself and Chris. If you're an undergraduate, go to any university, more or less. The undergraduate syllabuses are more or less the same. They're standardised, you'll use the same textbooks, you'll do the same suite of subjects, and of course you will not learn almost any of the things that we've spoken about today in undergraduate education. I would say in almost anywhere in the world you would not learn this. You will need to discover the library all by yourself, and go down to the library and read stuff by Coase and Buchanan and Hayek and Mises and Kerzner and so on and so forth. Ellen Ostrom as well, maybe not at the undergraduate level, but discover the library and go and read this stuff yourself, or go online. The Mises Institute, I'm not a big fan of a lot of their views, but they've done a magnificent job of getting a lot of the classic literature back into print, which you can download at zero price. The online Library of Liberty, there's a lot of stuff there you can download at zero price. So if you want to study economics generally, for undergraduate, almost any university in Australia will be as good as any other, more or less. But you do need to supplement it with your own reading. And if you have a PhD proposal, please pass it to Jason on your way out the door, and we will be looking very carefully at taking you. So thank you.
Thank you very much.